So I got involved with theories of change back when I became particularly interested in outcome mapping, because outcome mapping reframes your activities and programs from a behavioural change point of view and creates more of a landscape that you're heading in a direction, not a single pathway that you're definitely going to go down. So it embedded complexity, and it also meant that we were not assuming a linear. You know, sometimes you wander around the landscape and double back on yourself and everything. So to try and map that landscape with causal linkages, I've always conceived as little jigsaw puzzles that just link things together. And those causal linkages for me, those mechanisms of change, are beyond the program. There should be some sort of evidence that agrees with those your ideas about those mechanisms of change, and then you map your program through that landscape. So the theory of change leads to the linear logic of a program with lots of space for changing direction within a program and to actually engaging with other bits of the landscape.
Similar, I think, in Oxfam's experience, the good thing about theories of change is it makes you think much more about the world outside before you start thinking about what are we going to do. And the longer you can keep that tension and look hard at how change happens in society, how change happens in politics, how change happens in the economy, before you start worrying about your own little program, the more likely you are to design a program that works. So it's getting those pub conversations, bar conversations into the office and saying, this is actually crucial, we've got to understand the context. It's not about coming up with a great plan, it's about responding to events. Then you talk about agility. Things keep changing, that's the nature of life. How do you build in a system where you can respond to those changes but still actually get on with the job? And that's, theories of change helps us do all of that. And if you wanted a one-liner from what it means for Oxfam, it's making sure that staff bring their political literacy that they have outside the office into the office and use it. And if we can do that, then theories of change will really help.
So how do you feel about people pushing back against the term theories of change? Because it's a bit of a scary term.
Yeah, we don't like it. We use how change happens because theories immediately makes people think they have to be theoretical and clever, and so academics love it and Oxfam staff tend not to.
I'm not sure academics love it, actually.
Okay, they probably. Okay.
I don't think anybody likes it.
So we don't use it, and every time I use it inside Oxfam, people slap my wrist and say, could you just use how change happens? Because that's less scary.
Right.
Models of change, drivers of change,
So in terms of research uptake, how can you narrow down your experience on theories of change?
I think the key, so Oxfam's understanding of research is a bit different from universities, from IES's. So we're quite instrumental about research. Often what we're doing is a combination of a literature review, some case studies, and then a real emphasis on affecting, influencing policy or the way people understand a particular issue. And one of the key things for that to work is that the researchers have to be able to get outside their own world and into the minds of the people they're trying to influence. And there's very little about the way academics are trained which helps them do that. I think there's a real block. The academic community is quite internal, it's incentive systems, what's praised, what's criticised, all reinforces a kind of herd mentality that doesn't prioritise actually speaking a language that your policy target
and that's true even of African universities and African colleges. It's extraordinary how many university professors you meet, and you say, oh, you're a professor of agriculture, so do you engage with the Ministry of Agriculture much? Oh no, it's like...
And postmodernism has a lot to answer for. Postmodernism has created this verbiage which makes everything IDS says more difficult to understand, to be honest. And I'm a visiting fellow there, so I can say that.
You can say that.
There are real problems about communications, and it's really interesting that it tends to be only the top guys who blog, who speak in 700-word chunks rather than 70,000-word chunks, and that's because they have the confidence and the prestige to do it. The incentive system in research otherwise means that you're running very high risk by saying, actually, I'm assuming this is going to be how change happens, because then someone will say, well, that's naive, that's stupid. How can you possibly think that? Whereas if you keep it all suitably vague and mysterious, you're much safer. So I think there are some real barriers to getting people to be explicit and clear about their theories of change.
One of the things we've just been discussing is that maybe DFID could, or any other donor, could create some skeletons of theories of change, particularly about research uptake. So this typology of research gets to this point, and then it might engage with the policy environment through these mechanisms. Maybe creating some skeletons that researchers could flesh out, but without necessarily requiring the researchers to do all the steps on that theory of change, but that way to clarify what is their responsibility and what is not their responsibility. The reason I say a few is because in the typologies of research, some research has to engage the user from the very start, whereas other research, let's say systematic reviews, doesn't necessarily need to engage the policy environment at the beginning, but can be then taken up and taken forward. What do you think to that idea?
Every time I come up with a typology on theories of change, people shoot it down and I'll stop. I become allergic to typologies after too many disastrous experiences. It's very easy for the skeletons to become straitjackets.
Yeah.
So I think that certainly say these are the questions you should be asking. Here are some examples of other researchers who've come up with theories of change in this situation, and if you've cut and paste this, we won't give you any money. You have to do the work yourself. This is not a compliance exercise. This is not box ticking. Here are some ways to help you think more widely. And any further than that, and it starts to actually become a problem, I think. I mean, the inertia towards turning these things into box ticking is pretty massive. We had a really interesting conversation in the seminar earlier that log frames weren't meant to be like log frames. Log frames were meant to be a log frame approach, which actually included all this stuff. And they got narrowed down because of the way institutions work to box ticking. And I would probably be prepared to put some money that in 5 years' time, theories of change will also be a box ticking exercise. But we owe it to ourselves to resist for as long as possible.
Yes.
I would look at the carrots side. I think there tends to be a default towards sticks, towards everybody has to do X or Y. And that doesn't seem to work with this. I think you're looking much more at when someone is a natural, when someone gets theories of change and uses it, how do we reward that? How do we say to all their peers, this person's got it, this person is doing it as it should be done, you are not, but that's not the problem. Look at this person if you want to see what success looks like. If we can shift to that, then I think we might get something. I think in Oxfam, if you ask everybody in Oxfam to blog, most of the blogs will be absolutely awful, everybody will hate doing it. So you find the people who like doing it and you reward them, in theory, and that works better.
We had an interesting example in our group of the stick. DFID introduced the you must spend 10% on communications, and a very prestigious research group in this country complained bitterly to the point where they had to meet with the minister or something, or very senior DFID people, and then the storyline went that 10 researchers stood there and just said can't be done, shouldn't be done, etc., and we're not going to do this. At which point the very senior person turned around and said, well, if you're not going to do it, then you don't get the money. And now, 5 years on, that very prestigious research organisation has a communication department and has a whole bunch of people working on research uptake.
Money talks in academia.
Yeah.
Definitely. And if it has some moderate amount of money to speak with.
I'd say if there was one other thing I'd add to these is if you could get every academic to shadow a policy target, a research target, a minister, a journalist, a civil servant, it doesn't matter. Shadow them for a couple of days so they try and understand a bit more the lives of the people they're trying to influence. I think that could have a real impact. And it doesn't seem impossible to me as a scheme, honestly.
We've just done a study on how much policy actors trust the media, and the trust is very low. And that is going to be partly because of incomplete or incorrect reporting. It's partly the language and the comprehension of the journalist. So in my theory of change as a researcher who is trying to get my research into policy, I may well have identified that policy actors listen to the radio on their way to work. Therefore, I would like to get my research onto the radio in order for that policy actor to become more aware of my research. But if the mechanism of change, the causal mechanism between me going and having an interview with a journalist and it turning into a radio program is faulty, then my theory of change has got weaknesses in it. And it may be that your other program description, where you're strengthening the capacities of journalists to understand scientific research or evidence, then comes into play because you're strengthening one bit of a theory of change. On the other hand, if I believe that journalists might not report my research accurately, then I have to ask myself the question, in my theory of change, are there other paths and routes on this landscape for getting my research in front of the policymaker in an engaging way?
I think the kind of media communications side is a tiny subset of getting research into policy. So yeah, they are linked, but the kind of research, who's involved in the governance of the research, the timing of the research, all these things are probably at least as important as how you're communicating once it's done. One of the problems with people thinking about research and theories of change is that they tend to think that that's what you do once the research is finished, and that you then have to just communicate it really well, and actually you've got to design it in order to have influence, and that's a very, very different process. So I think I'm worried if this gets reduced down to better communications, because actually it's more fundamental than that.